When the United States declared a war on terrorists and the nations that harbored them after the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, Arab states and their sympathizers argued many of the organizations that engage in violent activities against American and Israeli civilians should not be targets of this new American campaign because they're freedom fighters rather than terrorists. This has been the mantra of the terrorists themselves, who claim that their actions are legitimate forms of resistance to Israeli quote-unquote occupation. This argument is deeply flawed. First, the enemies of Israel rationalize that any attack is legitimate because of either real or imagined grievances committed by Jews since the beginning of the 20th century. Consequently, the Arab bloc and its supporters at the United Nations have succeeded in blocking any condemnation throughout the history of the UN of any terrorist attacks against Israel. Instead, they routinely sponsor resolutions that condemn Israel every time it retaliates for a terrorist atrocity. Second, nowhere else in the world is the murder of innocent men, women, and children considered a legitimate form of resistance. The long list of heinous crimes includes snipers shooting infants, suicide bombers blowing up pizzerias and discotheques, hijackers taking and killing hostages, infiltrators murdering athletes. Hizballah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the PFLP, and a number of other groups, mostly Palestinian, have engaged in these activities for decades and rarely have been condemned or brought to justice. All of them qualify as terrorist groups according to the U.S. government's own definition, which is, quote, terrorism is the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. And therefore, these should all be targets of the U.S. effort to cut off the funding and root out the leaders and bring them to justice. In the case of the Palestinian groups, there's no mystery as to who the leaders are, where their funding comes from, and which nations harbor them. American charitable organizations have been linked to funding some of these groups, and Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and the Palestinian Authority all shelter and/or financially and logistically support them.